Hello and welcome to the Week in 60 Minutes, brought to you by SpectatorTV on the 13th of October. I'm Cindy Yu, the Spectator's broadcast editor. Coming up on the show, the destruction of Kerch Bridge in Crimea was yet another setback for Putin in his war with Ukraine. I speak to Owen Matthews and Dmitri Alperovitch about whether the president's position is secure and what he could do next. But Ukrainians have already suffered retaliation, with hundreds of missiles launched at the country this week. I speak to Svitlana Morenets about the pattern of Putin's attacks. Back home, Liz Truss is also a leader in a position of weakness. I'm joined by James Forsyth, Katy and Isabel Hardman to discuss whether the mood in the Conservative Party has, rather unbelievably, got even worse. We'll also be giving you a sneak preview of Katy's interview with Fiona Hill, Theresa May's former Chief of Staff, who, along with Nick Timothy, was blamed for a lot of where May's premiership went wrong. Over in China, another National Party Congress is about to start, giving Xi Jinping at least another 5 years in power. I talked to Charlie Parton about China's president for life. And finally, what happened to a more elegant period of train travel? On the show, Peter Hitchens reminisces about the London to Paris Golden Arrow, and we ask, does everything have to be so grey and functional these days? This episode is sponsored by Canaccord Genuity Wealth Management, experienced wealth planners and investment managers who offer unwavering support in challenging times. Visit Can Do Wealth for more information. And why not subscribe to our YouTube channel too? Click the red subscribe button at the bottom of this video and tap the bell icon to make sure you never miss an episode. First up, is Putin's Kremlin showing cracks? Russia has suffered numerous setbacks in recent weeks, the latest being the humiliating destruction of Kerch Bridge in Crimea. Owen Matthews writes this week's cover article explaining the factional rivalry within the Russian elite. He joins the show now, together with foreign policy analyst Dmitri Alperovitch. So, Owen and Dmitri, welcome to Spectator TV. To start with, Owen, can you tell us about this video that you start your article writing about this week? What are we seeing here?
The video is filmed by an anonymous person, a mobilized soldier, complaining very vociferously and actually shouting about the conditions in which the new mobilized reservists have been living, and he pans around and he says at the beginning, there are 500 of us, we are armed, we don't know where we're going, they're obviously on their way to somewhere because there's literally a train standing right next to them, and various other members of that group, most of them who are masked, are shouting, and we've been living and the officers are treating us like farm animals, we've been buying our own food and so on. But the reason why I cite this video is actually not what it obviously says, but what it non-obviously says. Because if you look at it carefully, in fact, several of the people in the video, in fact, one person is very prominent in the video, is wearing the patches of the Wagner Group, which is a private military company, which has received a huge amount of funding and support from the Kremlin, and has been recruiting all over very actively, including from prisons, recruiting people for Putin's war in Ukraine. And crucially, this video was distributed through Telegram channels associated with the head of that private military company. So it's not just a video about discontented, mobilized reservists. It's a video of somebody who has a private military company trying to discredit the Russian Ministry of Defense. And that, I thought, was a good starting point to discuss the various sort of cracks that are appearing in and the criticism that's being leveled at the conduct of the war. And so far, that criticism has been leveled at the Minister of Defense, at the generals and so on. It has not yet been leveled at Putin and the top of the Kremlin. But the question I explore in my piece is, at what point does that criticism move beyond the prosecution of the war and of the Kremlin's leadership instead?
And Owen, I think it's important to say that this criticism that you're talking about specifically doesn't come from a pacifist perspective. They're ultra-nationalists, am I right in saying that? And they think that their problem with the war is that it hasn't been conducted efficiently enough, successfully enough, not that the war shouldn't happen.
Well, that's a broader question. If we're looking at the whole spectrum of opposition to Putin, I think what's underappreciated in the West is that Alexei Navalny, who is in jail, obviously in Siberia now, speaks for a certain section of the opposition, but he doesn't speak for the most dangerous section of the opposition, which is the ultranationalists who think that Putin has not been prosecuting this war with sufficient vigor. And actually, that's the constituency which I think worries the Kremlin and the people who form what you might call a sort of a collective Putin, the decision-making, that very small decision-making clique at the top of the Kremlin. They're much more worried about the nationalists and the criticism and the political threat from the right than from the pro-Navalny, pro-Western liberals who oppose the war, who are sort of, I suppose you could call them on the political left.
Dmitri, let me bring you in here. Are we then going to be seeing, or have we already seen, Putin trying to appease this wing of the political dynamic by becoming more aggressive himself, by appeasing some of their demands? In other words, is he going to be escalating because he's being prodded and shoved into ever stronger positions?
I actually don't think that Putin is very much concerned about criticism that's coming from the right. In fact, this is a time-honored tradition, not just in Putin's government, but frankly, in many governments in both Soviet and Tsarist era in Russia, where you encourage divisions within your group of advisors and infighting so that no one becomes too strong. And I'm sure that Putin is not necessarily upset that Prigozhin and Kadyrov, the head of Chechnya, Prigozhin, of course, the head of Wagner, are criticizing Defense Minister Shoigu and the head of General Staff Gerasimov. Putting more pressure on them is something that Putin may actually like because he is very well aware that the war is not being prosecuted well. But I think his decision to annex the territories, the 4 oblasts in Ukraine a couple of weeks ago was really key because it was a metaphorical burning of the boats. There's no turning back from that. He can't politically just unannex them and pretend it never happened. There's obviously been a change in Russian constitution to incorporate these oblasts. And, if you're someone who is even considering opposing Putin, you can't necessarily run on a platform of undoing that. You don't want to be going into the Russian history, into the annals of Russian history, saying that you are the one that gave up lands, Russian lands, newly conquered Russian lands. History is usually not kind to those sorts of people. So I think that was a way for Putin to shore up support, to make it less likely that there will be opposition, and to actually signal to people within his government that were getting wobbly about this war, including even those in the Ministry of Defense that were lobbying him to abandon certain parts of the territory. We know that, for example, in Kherson, the Ministry of Defense was asking him to withdraw because their position on that side of the river is becoming untenable. And not only did he say no, but with this annexation, he basically signaled to them, you're going to fight for every inch of these oblasts that are now ostensibly Russian territory that he has proclaimed through that action.
So, Dmitri, do you think Putin is still in control of the situation?
Well, to the extent that anyone is in control, obviously, if you look at the military situation, things are going from bad to worse for him. He's continuing to lose ground. But in terms of his power base in Russia, I think it's still very much secure. There's no natural leader, opposition leader. There's no Lenin. There's no Yeltsin that could organize a coup against him. He has ensured that all opposition like that would be eliminated either through assassinations that he has conducted over the course of the last 2 decades, or jailing people or exiling them. So I think he's feeling very secure. Of course, I have to note that coups are always very, very unlikely right up until the moment they actually happen. So it's impossible to predict the future, but I don't think that it's particularly likely at this point.
Owen?
Yeah, I think Dmitri's absolutely on the money. I think that's right. But I think it's worthwhile differentiating. There are coups from without and coups from within. So I completely agree that Putin has a very deep and very powerful political resource behind him. The machine that he's built up, both in terms of media manipulation and of repression and state control, is enormously efficient, and he's actually done a fantastically good job of bringing the country with him and Furthermore, there's been 20 years of brainwashing about the dangers of change and how terrible revolutionary change is in Russia. And they don't really even need to, most Russians of a certain age don't need to hear it from the television. They themselves, they felt it on their own hides, in the Russian phrase. They saw the 1990s. Revolution and revolutionary change and change of power is actually, a much more scary thing to most Russians than it is to the West, because for the obvious reasons that historically that has not been an easy or successful process twice in the 20th century. So the Russians are there's actually there's a very strong power resource that Putin still controls. However, there's a problem. He himself has, of course, created this problem, and he's painted himself into a corner in the sense that over the summer, he really could have, after he'd taken Lysychansk and Severodonetsk, he was on a roll. He could have declared victory, basically sort of pretended nothing had happened and said, we're starting a peace process. And that would definitely have split the Allies. It really would have, because Macron would have come in to do his Macron thing, sort of peace, and but instead of doing that, he did what Putin has Putin always does, which is escalate in a really stupid way. So therefore, what he's done is he's made his political career a hostage to defeat in the field. And that's tactically a very stupid thing to do, because why would you want to risk your entire regime over whether parts of Kherson are part of Ukraine or part of Russia? Literally no one cares, except the Ukrainians, of course, they care. But in terms of the Russian elite, no one cares about those details. But Putin, as Dmitri rightly said, has suddenly made that a matter of life and death for his regime. So the one caveat of this picture of the strength of his power and his hold on the Russian people's psyche and on the security apparatus, the one caveat to that is if he suffers catastrophic military defeat in the field. And at that point, the strain on the entire system becomes enormous. And unlike in the Soviet Union, unlike in 1964, when, say, the party moved to remove Nikita Khrushchev from power, there's no institutions. It's just people. It's just what the Russians call понятия. It's understanding. It's just like a group of old mates who run Russia. There is no institution there's no institutional way or constitutional way in which there could really be a reasonable handover of power. But again, that situation will only happen if there is catastrophic military defeat.
Well, that's a point that I think really sticks with me, Owen, because, coming as I do, looking at things often from the Chinese perspective, I've been looking at the party congress that's coming up next week, where Xi Jinping is almost certain to renew his power. At the same time, the Chinese Communist Party, with its 92 million members, is such a massive institution that even Xi has to sometimes bow to it, so that if he goes, there will be others who follow. Dmitri, what does succession look like in this system, in this environment that Putin has built up?
Well, if you look at the history of Russian coups, you need the support, particularly in the Soviet era, you need the support of the intelligence services or elements of the intelligence services. They don't necessarily, the ones historically are the ones that take power, but their support is often crucial. So it's most likely to be someone that is still a strong man, that has the confidence of those people, maybe once was part of their apparatus, someone like Nikolai Patrushev, currently the head of the Security Council, another old FSB colleague of Vladimir Putin, actually replaced him as the head of the FSB and used to work with him in the KGB back in the 70s and 80s. He is, of course, even more hardline than Putin. If there is a change, I'm not sure it necessarily will indicate a change in policy vis-a-vis Ukraine, because people are going to be much more hardline. And by the way, the example that Ian just brought up with the coup against Nikita Khrushchev and actually Khrushchev replacing Stalin, you've seen a more hardline policy develop vis-a-vis the West. Stalin dies, and Khrushchev comes to power, and then we get the Cuban Missile Crisis because Khrushchev decides that he needs to escalate and show himself to be a strongman. So the history does not indicate that we're in for a rosy scenario here.
And just finally, I want to get both of your thoughts on the possible escalation, the next steps, because we've talked about how Putin escalates has done so far. Everyone is worried about nuclear weapons and a tactical nuclear strike in Ukrainian territory. Owen, to start with, do you think that is the next step? Could that happen?
Well, put it this way. Over the last 10 days, two things have happened. Over the last 2 weeks, two things have happened that I've been watching Russia more or less all my life. I've been doing this professionally for like 30 years. Two things blew my mind and terrified me for the first time in a lifetime, professional lifetime of watching Russia. That was the destruction of the Nord Stream pipelines, and that was really quite extraordinarily. I mean, I haven't seen any kind of real reasonable scenario whereby anyone other than the Russians did that to themselves. I mean, perhaps they didn't, but that would be an even madder conspiracy theory than the one that says that they did. I mean, that's indicates to me that there is something very profoundly, scarily amiss, and there's a very profound disconnect between, actual, rationality and reality, and the information that's and realities on the ground, and the behavior of the Kremlin and the special services that basically have controlled the Kremlin for decades. So, in a world where Russia can blow up the major source of its own revenue and political influence in Russia by blowing up 10 billion euro pipelines, is a world where anything that can happen. So, I mean, we can have a rational discussion over why it's suicidal for Putin to use nuclear weapons in the field, and I think it will be, because I think that will lead to a massive conventional response, defeat in the field, and political crisis in Russia. So suicidal in that sense. But that would be a rational discussion. I mean, post Nord Stream 2, I'm not sure that any kind of rational discussion applies to the decision-making of Putin and his inner circle.
And was the other thing that blew your mind the Kerch Bridge explosion?
Well, and no, I mean, the other thing that blew my mind was their sudden decision to mobilize and to annex the territories. I mean, just like on the spur of the moment. I mean, they've been planning. They've been refusing to do it for like months and months and months and months, and then suddenly they do it on the spur of the moment, and they do it in a week.
And Dmitri?
On the nuclear weapons side, I actually think in the short term it's become less likely because Putin is steadily escalating, but mobilization was his escalation answer to this war in the short term. He's clearly hoping that sending hundreds of thousands of mobilized troops, even untrained, into the conflict is going to somehow change his fortunes. I think that's unlikely. I think he's mistaken on that front. But over the long term, I think clearly the risks are increasing. I do think that the way he thinks about nuclear weapons is primarily as a signal, and primarily as a signal to the West, not Zelensky. He's convinced that Zelensky is a pawn of the West. Of course, that's nonsense, but he, I think, truly believes that. And I think if he does use a nuclear weapon, it's probably going to be more likely to be a demonstration blast in a remote area, perhaps over the Black Sea, maybe over something symbolic like Snake Island, but with very little, if any, casualties, and as a way to show to Washington and London, the two places that Russia believes are in control of everything, in a very conspiratorial way that they tend to behave, that they're serious, and as a way to try to get them to rein in Zelensky. It won't work, of course, but I think that's how they're going to think about this in Moscow. Very
interesting. Dmitri and Owen, thank you so much for joining Spectator TV. Ukrainians have already started feeling Putin's escalation as hundreds of missiles were launched at them since the Kerch Bridge explosion. But more than just general attacks, Svitlana Morenets, author of the Spectator's Today in Ukraine newsletter, sees a pattern in these targets. Putin is trying to destroy the country's preparedness for winter. She joins the show. So, Svitlana, welcome to Spectator TV. After the bombing of the Kerch Bridge, Putin has been launching a counteroffensive through sending missiles into Ukraine. But you've written for The Spectator that you think there's a strategy here other than just general destruction, that he's targeting certain things.
Yes, but I would like to add that for sure his aim is to threaten Ukrainians and to make them panic. But I think that his main strategy right now is to bomb Ukrainian power plants. Mm-hmm. So the civil people will be left without electricity and water. And I think it is like a rehearsal before winter because he just tries to find the weak spots in Ukrainian air defense system. And then in winter he can bomb it, and in Ukraine the weather can reach minus 25 in winter, and then that really will be a problem because Ukrainians were getting ready for staying without gas this winter, but staying without electricity too, it's gonna be really tough. So I think he's just trying to see what he can do, and in winter he will be launching much more missiles.
And do you think he has liked what he's seen so far in terms of his capabilities? Or has he succeeded so far?
I would say yes and no, because in Monday and Friday they launched about 100 missiles, and half of them were shot down by Ukrainian army.
Okay.
It is still not enough, but in February we couldn't shut down anything, and now it is half. So he's losing a lot of rockets and a lot of money, obviously. Yeah. But anyway, 5 thermal plants were hit, and some regions were without electricity. And now Ukrainians were asked voluntarily turn off the electricity for 4 hours in the evening, 4 hours in the morning. But it seems that in 1 week they will have to do it it will be just turned off by the government.
Really?
Because they try to repair the thermal power plants, and it takes time, and so Ukrainians are already seeing the consequences.
Yeah, but people will die because of how cold it gets, as you've mentioned. I mean, if you can't...
Yes, especially people on the east where the infrastructure was bombed, there will be no gas. Ukrainians already started evacuation from the east of Ukraine. Yeah. But anyway, we can't move millions of people just to the west, it's impossible.
Mm-hmm. And that's obviously something that's very much on Ukrainian people's minds, on the government's mind. What about the threat of the nuclear attack as well? Because that's something that we here in London, we can talk about in an abstract sense, but are people on the streets in Ukraine, are they concerned that they might be the target of a nuclear attack?
For sure they are concerned, but they can't do anything. Mm-hmm. Ukraine is a non-nuclear country. Unfortunately, we gave up the third largest nuclear arsenal a lot of years ago, and all of Ukrainians are very regretted of that right now, but we can't do anything. And the problem is that 40 million people can't leave the country because of the threat of nuclear attack. We can't do anything. And what Ukrainians hope that if it happens, that the West will react, but not only with sanctions, but they expect that or they shoot Russia back, or the army comes to help our army, or something like that, something more than just words. Because right now, Ukrainian army is winning on the east. We are advancing. Only today, 5 settlements were liberated in Kherson region. We can win this war, but not a nuclear war.
Yeah, not without help. Svitlana Morenets, thank you so much for joining Spectator TV. If you enjoy Spectator TV, then why not subscribe to the magazine? Go to spectator.co.uk/TV offer to try 1 month of the magazine in print and online for free. Now, will Liz Truss have to U-turn on even more of her tax cuts? That's the question dominating Westminster this week, as the Prime Minister barely manages to steady the ship. I'm joined by political editor James Forsyth, deputy political editor Katy and assistant editor Isabel Hardman. Katy, Isabel and James, welcome back to Spectator TV. Now, Katy, over the weekend we heard about this charm offensive that the new Prime Minister Liz Truss is going to be going on. But last night we had her first meeting with her backbenchers in the 1922 committee, and it doesn't actually seem like this charm offensive is going all that well.
Yeah, I think as charm offences go, I think this one has run into problems pretty early on. We had lots of briefings. Ultimately, Liz Truss hasn't had much time in the Commons since becoming Prime Minister, partly, of course, because of the funeral of the Queen and also party conference season. So you had a situation where her Prime Minister's questions this week was her second ever as Prime Minister. Yet what has happened between the first and the second has been, very substantial. You have had a not so many budget, which has backfired, which has completely changed, I think, the tone of Liz Truss's premiership. The problems she's facing are now all being linked back to that. Of course, Liz Truss's government say there's global factors there too. But it does just feel a world away from, just a month ago. And therefore, what we heard over the weekend was Liz Truss would try and restore relations with the parliamentary party. And this is by a few means, one of which was, reaching out more to MPs. You hear this really with every Prime Minister. But part of this was to address the 1922 committee. I think it's fair to say that did not go to plan. Depending who you speak to, I think there are various blame games going underway. But I think what is pretty clear from speaking to MPs from all wings of the party is that the mood was awful. One said, it was very painful. Another MP described it to me as brutal. And it was largely hostile questions. So I think there are about two fairly neutral questions. I don't think they could be described as positive, and then the rest were pretty critical. Now, there's obviously lots to criticise if you look at what's happening in the markets, if you look at the Labour poll lead. But I think what was unnerving Liz Truss supporters was how these questions were not coming from one specific faction. They were spread all over. And actually, journalists who were outside the room where this was happening, one point said, there's lots of desk banging. And I think often that can be read as support for the Prime Minister. After a few calls, it seems to me that desk banging might have been actually after a question from a Tory MP who said we need to get back to fiscal responsibility, fiscal credibility for the Tory party. And apparently that won the biggest cheer of the night. And that is bad news for Liz Truss.
So, James, you look at the situation in the markets for your political column this week for the magazine. Is the only thing that will appease these Tory MPs further U-turns on the tax cuts from her fiscal event?
Yeah, and I think this is one of the problems for Liz Truss, which is it's very hard to see how you square the circle of doing enough to reassure the markets, but not blowing up your political authority in the process. And I think what is difficult, and you see this now, is that, if you talk to very, very senior people in the government, they admit that, one of the things that went wrong with the mini budget was that there were lots of things in there that the markets weren't expecting. The markets are now expecting a U-turn on the corporation tax cut. I don't think that is where Liz Truss and Forsyth are right now as of Thursday morning. And so I think if on October the 31st they don't U-turn on corporation tax, the markets will be surprised and potentially you'll have more market turbulence. I think that's the risk. The other thing to watch for is on Friday, the Bank of England ends its intervention in the gilts market. What then happens when the markets reopen on Monday? Do we get more volatility? I think even if you take aside the Bank of England intervention and the like, it is worth looking at what is happening to debt interest payments. The Institute for Fiscal Studies estimates that they will now be over 100 billion. That is twice what the OBR were estimating back in March. And this obviously makes the whole attempt to show that you're going to get debt falling as a percentage of GDP much more difficult. And that what makes these debt interest payments so politically painful is you don't get anything for them. There's not a single extra police officer. There's not a single extra hospital or doctor, despite the fact that you're spending twice as much on debt interest as you expected to be back in March.
Mm-hmm. And Isabel, in amongst all of this, Labour seems to be getting on an election footing. This week, Keir Starmer has made some personnel changes. Can you tell us about the plans that the opposition party are making?
Yeah, so he, as you say, announced that Labour was going on to an election war footing, saying that the instability of the government is such that it could fall at any moment. And really what all of this was an attempt to was to say, we had a good conference, but we know we've still got a lot more work to do because I think Labour MPs and people around Keir Starmer were so happy after their sort of serious, sober party conference followed by the meltdown in Birmingham, that it would be tempting for them to think, particularly given the consistently good poll leads that the party has, that they've got it in the bag. And two problems there. One is that voters aren't really thinking about Labour at the moment. They're just looking at the Tories and thinking, oh my God. And the other thing is that even if Labour does have an election in the bag, which, you know, actually I'm not sure is yet the case, it's not a party that's fully ready to be a good government. And so that's why this was briefed out as well. It wasn't something that just sort of happened under the radar. It was an attempt to say, look, we're getting really serious now. And so the changes that Starmer announced this week, one is that the party headquarters are moving out of their current location in Southside. Another is that his chief of staff, Sam White, has been amicably sacked. And look, I mean, you know, most people in the UK have not heard of Sam White. So it's very much an internal Westminster thing, but it does point to some of the tensions that have been under the surface within the leader's office. There have been some power struggles between the many people around Keir Starmer, and indeed there were shadow cabinet members who very much liked Sam White but didn't think he was the sort of person who should be leading things from the leader's office side as the party approaches the really tough fight of a general election. I think this doesn't really resolve some of the bigger tensions, though, within the shadow cabinet, within the team around Starmer. There's a debate about how much emphasis to put on green issues, how far left to go. We obviously had the two policies at the Labour conference. The two main policies were basically sort of nationalisations of various things. And I think, you know, talking to those in the shadow cabinet, that they're quite anxious that the party branches out from that, doesn't end up with a sort of Ed Miliband 2.0 offer as it goes into the next election, because it's worth remembering, as much as those around Starmer like Ed Miliband, that the electorate did roundly reject him back in 2015. So I think there's still a lot of questions to be answered. And one of the biggest ones is actually, where is Starmer in all of this? You've got a lot of people around him, but what does he personally stand for? What is Starmerism? We've obviously learned quite a lot about what Trussism is over the past few weeks, but we still don't really know what the leader himself stands for and whether he's strong enough to lead a government.
Well, the chaos with Ed Miliband surely can't be much worse than what we've got at the moment. Isabel, James and Katy, thanks very much. This week, Katy has also interviewed Fiona Hill, Theresa May's former chief of staff, for a Women with Balls podcast. Together with Nick Timothy, Hill was blamed for a lot of where the May administration first went wrong. This is her first interview since leaving government, and we can give a sneak preview here.
I felt like it was going to plan until we got into the 2017 election.
So on that, Theresa May calls the election. It's after there have been strong suggestions she would not do that. What did you support the decision to call an early election? Or?
Yeah. And I still think it was the right. I think it was the only thing that we had to do, because the majority was so slim. And if you look now back with hindsight, how difficult it has been since then, there was no way that we couldn't try it out and have an election. And based on, as you said, Katy, the polls indicated that we would win fairly well. What, of course, you can't bake into your thinking is whether or not the campaign you ultimately run has the right momentum. And I don't think the 2017 election campaign ever really had the right momentum for a number of reasons, some in our gift and a lot outside our control. But with election campaigns, they're almost like the voodoo that you know so well. You can get luck, and you can also get bad luck, and it doesn't matter if you've got your messages right or this and that right or wrong. Sometimes it's just a quite unquantifiable momentum or indeed otherwise.
There's always a bit of luck in politics too.
Yeah, and life in general.
What do you think went wrong that was in the control, I suppose, of Theresa May, those around her?
Well, I didn't get a sense that she was really enjoying it.
Yeah.
And I think that ultimately journalists pick up on that in a campaign. I think it's documented that I wasn't a supporter of the social health care policy. It was a very long campaign. I mean, it took me weeks to catch up on sleep. I mean, it was a tough campaign.
What was it about the social care policy specifically that you just...
Well, I'd worked with Jeremy Haywood on it in government. We were actually number 10. And I knew that it had been tested properly. It'd only been tested inside the confines of the civil service. My view was to really get under the skin of what it was, is that it should go out to, say, like the King's Fund or go out somewhere and be tried and tested and then come back into government. I, of course, understand that we need to do something about social health care, but I didn't feel like this policy, which was a complex policy, if something's complex to understand or to communicate, then it means that it hasn't been tried and tested enough. And I didn't feel it had been.
Yeah, we see that a lot with the more recent governments. Was there a point when you thought perhaps the Tories would lose that election? Was there a point before it? Or, and if not, I wondered that exit poll really.
There was a moment after the Manchester arena bombing where we were travelling by plane up to Manchester, and the cockpit windows shattered, and we had to drop a couple of... I'm terrible with metrics, I'm afraid, but we had to drop from the sky, but not to the ground. So somewhere halfway in between. Right. And I hadn't really been feeling particularly great about the general direction of the campaign anyway. But there was something about that moment that I felt was a bit of an omen, and that I felt, like I said, some bad things happen during campaigns, and it's hard, to campaign for politics when people have lost their life. I mean, it's a really ugly thing had happened. You're not going out and saying strong and stable too much after that.
Yeah.
And so that slows everything down, and it has to. It absolutely has to. But overall, I just felt things were not going to plan.
And when the exit poll came through, because I remember coming through just doing the live blog from next door, and it was a slightly like spit your tea out of your mug moment. What was your reaction?
Well, one of the best things I did that evening was I got my sister to come into CCHQ. And I think it must have been around maybe 5 to 10, but as you can imagine, my memory's a bit blurry. And Andy Marr called me and told me what the exit poll was, and I felt like basically I'd been kicked in the stomach, and I was aware that I was there in body, but I wasn't really there at all in my mind. And I was just so grateful for my sister being there, because she kind of directed me almost, and then of course I had to tell Nick, and then I had a call from Theresa asking me to go down to the constituency, which I did, but I don't think I was there very long. She had her count, and then I was in another car coming back up to CCHQ, and my sister had stayed on in the hotel room I was staying in, thank goodness. And then I got there about 5 o'clock in the morning, and she'd already packed up all my clothes and poured me into a taxi. And the rest,
good sister.
Yeah, she's a wonderful sister. And I felt bad for my sister, and particularly for my brother during that period, because my brother was a BBC journalist in Westminster, and I can't imagine how it would have felt for him going into work the next day. I felt quite guilty about that. So all in all, it was what we probably would describe as a low point in one's career.
If you enjoy that, you can watch the full interview on Spectator TV this Saturday. Putin and Truss might like to take some notes from the one leader that does seem to be doing quite well. China's presidency is about to be confirmed for another 5 years as leader, taking the country back to Maoist times. I'm joined by Charlie Parton, former diplomat in Beijing and senior associate fellow at the think tank RUSI, to discuss what this might all mean. So, Charlie Parton, welcome to Spectator TV. Now, on Sunday, another National Party Congress will be opening in Beijing. In previous years and eras, this was a moment for leadership reshuffles, for the General Secretary to sometimes be changed. But is it fair to assume that Xi Jinping will not be stepping down over the coming weeks?
I don't think Lau Brooks is offering any odds at all on him stepping down. I've not yet come across a commentator who thinks that he will. So we will all be immensely surprised if someone else takes over.
So how has he got to this stage then? Because the Chinese Communist Party must be more cutthroat than even the Conservative Party here in the UK. And yet Xi Jinping has had 10 years in power. There's this informal convention that the General Secretary steps down after 10 years after Chairman Mao died. And yet he's completely turned that over on its head, even though his two predecessors followed that rule.
Yeah, it's a very good question, because it's not just that there's precedent that he's gone against. He must have offended an awful lot of people in China. I mean, given that perhaps 1 million people have fallen foul of the Discipline Commission, and you multiply that by their families and their supporters and adherents, etc. If you think about how he's offended anyone who believes in religion by cutting out on that, ethnic minorities, all the people who've lost out in the party power struggles, etc., etc. Must be a vast mass of opposition to him, and yet nobody dares to put their head above the parapet, and I don't think I don't anticipate that anyone does. And what he's done is really controlled what I call the 7 centres of power inside the Communist Party. He controls the Central Committee. That's 205 full members and 172 alternates, people who don't get the vote but are obviously still very powerful. He controls basically the Politburo, the 25 members that get chosen from the Central Committee. And he controls the Politburo Standing Committee, the 7 most, one might say, most powerful people. But beyond that, he also controls the Secretariat of the Central Committee, which organises business. And if you control what business a body does, that's very important. He controls the Central Military Commission and the PLA, the People's Liberation Army, and the People's Armed Police, which is the backup for the regime. And he controls the Central Commission for Discipline Inspection, which is a very powerful weapon. You start being vaguely disloyal and you may find yourself up on a discipline or a corruption charge. And the 7th set is the 2,851 party county secretaries, a county level administrative region, ranging from anything sort of 500,000 to even 2 million souls. So these are powerful people, and gradually his control is extending down to them. And then you add in the important party departments, organisations, the courts, the proctorate, and a whole of the security services. He's really got his people there. And you look what he's done. He's put people he trusts and knows in all those positions. And again, when we come to the Central Committee of this current, just about to start, party congress, it's one of its roles is, quotes, to elect the new Central Committee. The delegates elect a new committee. They don't, of course. I mean, in effect, it's been already chosen because of those 205 full members. If you add in people that are all bound to be there almost ex officio, given the jobs that they have, the party provincial secretaries, the governors, so that's the number 1s and 2s, that's over 60 people, 40 military, the heads of party departments, etc., etc. You take up pretty much all of those 205 places already. I mean, I would say well over 190, probably 195 are already decided. And they're all Xi Jinping's people. So, you know, he's very much in control.
So is this saying something that we here in the West overlook, which is that he's actually, the direction that he's taking China in is actually relatively popular? Or is it saying something about his personality and his intelligence, that he's managed to institutionally kind of grab all of this power, or that his charisma is such that everyone just wants to follow him? Which, I mean, that last explanation is something that I don't really see. I mean, I don't see in him the kind of charismatic leader that Chairman Mao was to some people. So Charlie, what do you put it down as?
Well, I think he's politically very astute in terms of the sort of, I mean, power in China is red claw and tooth and nail stuff, and he's obviously navigates that extremely well. What you hear from insiders is that he's not particularly intellectually intelligent, but as sure as hell he knows how to play the power game. Is he popular? I don't think we should discount that in many ways. I mean, you're right. I don't think he's not particularly charismatic, etc. But over the last 10 years, you know, the China has, and they played it very strongly in the propaganda as well. China has done reasonably well. People have come out better than they were 10 years ago. They play the nationalist drum about how powerful China is and influential in the world, and that goes down well with the people. The question is whether in the last couple of years that the shine is not coming off that. I mean, not only because people are very upset by the zero COVID policy and the restrictions that that's put on their life, but because the economy is now facing some very severe headwinds. I mean, youth unemployment, for instance, is around 20%. I mean, that's the official figure, so one presumes it might even be higher. And so I think looking forward, Xi Jinping, you know, will not be as popular. And as I said at the start, there are an awful lot of people who have reason to dislike him, just as there are an awful lot of people so far who have, you know, been relatively supportive of what he's achieved. So headwinds, I think, is going to be tough in the third term.
When it comes to these headwinds, you know, when you look at zero COVID or the way that the economy is doing, you know, a lot of it can be traced down to Xi's own agenda, his own policies, whether it's, you know, zero COVID or it's common prosperity or something like that. So do you think we're going to be seeing, now that he's got a third term, a continuation of these main policies, or is he going to be changing tack?
Well, you know, the phrase about Margaret Thatcher comes to mind, the lady's not for turning. And I just don't see Xi Jinping being that way inclined either. I mean, he is very ideological. I think he is a firm believer in what he calls Marxism, but in practice really is Leninism, a sort of nationalist Leninism. Although it is, as in Steve Tsang, the professor from SARS phrase, it is consultative Leninism. They do consult. They don't necessarily let that consultation get in the way of a decision when it really matters. But he is very, I think, dogmatic in the literal sense of the word. I mean, he believes this dogma and this theory. And, you know, you look back to 2013, the third plenum, and there was a lot of talk about reform and making the market decisive in the role of the allocation of resources and a more refined state role. Well, you know, that reform hasn't happened. And on the contrary, I mean, he's strengthened the economy, he's strengthened party control, both by boosting state-owned enterprises, but also mammothly increasing you know, party cells and party branches within private companies. I think it's very difficult to think that suddenly after, I mean, it would be such an extraordinarily sharp U-turn. It would be a handbrake, you know, J-turn or whatever it is that these fancy drivers do. And I just don't think that's his character. Looking at the external side, I mean, the way that America is reacting and increasingly perhaps other free and open countries are reacting, that too is hostile. And the reaction to that is increased hostility on the part of Xi Jinping and the Communist Party. That too would be difficult to back off from, I think.
Yeah. It'll be interesting to see when that unpopularity in the party will get to a tipping point. Charlie Parton, thank you so much for joining Spectator TV.
Pleasure, Cindy.
And finally, what happened to leisurely train travel with dining carts and Pullman armchairs? In this week's issue, Peter Hitchens reminisces the Golden Arrow route, which went from London to Paris. Miles better than a Eurostar, he says, which does that route now. He joins the show. So, Peter, I must admit, I didn't know about the Golden Arrow trains until I read your piece.
Well, I'm so pleased I've told you. Have you looked it up since?
I've looked it up, but can you tell us more about it?
Oh,
your
it was the
experience
last and lingering piece of railway luxury. It still ran. You took a very comfortable train from London Victoria to Dover, and then you went on an old-fashioned ferry which had no room in it for cars, climbed off the end, went through the French customs in a proper shed, men with horizon blue uniforms stamping your passport, the sûreté, and then you walked across the railway yards onto the Flèche d'Or, the French version of the Golden Arrow, which was all lovely Pullman cars. And in those days, they still hitched a steam locomotive to that, as far as Amiens. But it was an old 1930s thing which the railways had run, and it was I have to boast here. I won a scholarship, and my parents said, "What would you like as a reward for this?" I said, "I'd like us all to go on the Golden Arrow to Paris," because I was certain, having looked around me, that this wouldn't last. It was something that would be gone soon, like ocean liners and all the other things that were still around. And so I was determined to do it, and so they wonderfully agreed. And we all four of us went, and it was the most marvellous journey.
And inside it was all beautifully decorated.
Oh, well, it was a bit downhill, like a lot of things in the 1960s, but it was still it had a certain grandeur and stateliness to it, and the service was beautiful. And I'd never had food like that before because I'd never been to France before. It was just beautifully cooked food, taken seriously and served seriously. It was all right on the other side. The English bit was quite, but it was basically you got breakfast, I think. And then on the way back, you got afternoon tea. So the proper business of lunch was on the French side, as it ought to be.
Right.
And it ended with this extraordinary discovery for me that there was actually a thing called coffee, which bore no relation to the noxious fluids that I'd been consuming under that name in Britain of the time. It was called Nescafe and something ghastly out of a bottle. And it was a complete revelation. Also, it was just a wonderful journey. The countryside between Calais and Paris isn't up to much. It's not. You're not suddenly somewhere spectacularly foreign, but the fact of being in this marvellous train that was plainly quite different from anything else anybody ever rode in for most of the time. So comfortable, so pleasantly old-fashioned, and so. I suppose there was a ceremony to it. Was a treat, and it was the first time I'd ever gone to Paris, and it always stuck with me every time I went afterwards that this was the ideal to which one could aspire, but never would again because the Golden Arrow had been cancelled by then. But I don't know how many times I did it before the tunnel was built. I lost count. But it was always that great lift of the spirit as the train pulled out heading for the Channel, and then the even greater lift as the French porters came on board the steamer, and then you found the French train waiting on the other side. It's an adventure.
Very different from the Eurostar.
Well, the Eurostar is great because you don't. I mean, it's so much quicker. You don't, and there is that enormous convenience. And we'd all felt for a very long time that a tunnel was probably a good idea. And so when it was finally built, I felt. I know Dick West used to swear never to use it, I think, because he thought it was, I think in some ways rightly, the end of us as an island nation, but I never felt like that. I thought, okay, I can now get to Paris more quickly. And I do remember when in the early years, it was different to the way it is now. The colouring of it was different. You could get slightly better food, as I recall. And now the new modernised one is very grey blue and chilly feeling and doesn't have even the last lingering bits of ceremony that the old one had.
Is it because of a pursuit of functionality? I mean, you say it's faster.
I think it is very functional. I think this is, and all high-speed trains are, I suppose, a bit functional. They have to follow boring flat bits of landscape because mountains and forests are a nuisance for high-speed railway engineers, but it's also there doesn't seem to have been any huge imagination put into the designing of everything. Why do you have to traipse through that stupid luggage check? It's not an aeroplane.
Yeah.
It's excessive. I mean, it's disproportionate. I've looked up. I can't find for certain, But I think and someone may correct me on this, but I looked up on the details of the bullet trains that go between the Japanese islands, for instance, and the amazing train that goes through the Gotthard base tunnel in Switzerland, that goes from Switzerland through to Italy, which are as long and as deep. I don't believe they do that for them. So why do they do it for passport control? I've always liked passport control.
Because of the ritual.
I love borders. I think borders are great. They're very thought-provoking and interesting, and I've always loved borders. And in any case, here is this strange thing. In the London borough of St Pancras, as used to be, there is now an exclave of France. It's really odd. But once you're through that border control, you're in France. So why isn't it more French?
Yeah.
When that strange subterranean area where you sit around waiting, and this is the other thing, waiting to be called for your train as if it was an aeroplane, which it isn't. I keep stressing this point. It's not an aeroplane, it's a train. Where you have to sit, it's not at all French.
Instead of just getting on a train.
It's like Heathrow.
Yeah.
And why can't you? When I get on a train at Paddington or King's Cross or Liverpool Street, I find out what the platform is. I go to the platform, I show my ticket, I show my passport if asked, and get on it. But with the Eurostar, you have to sit around until your train is called as if it was an aeroplane. It isn't. I have to say this again. It isn't an aeroplane.
So, Peter, in preparing to talk to you, I came across some of these amazing companies that kind of recreate the Golden Arrow experience. The price tag was pretty expensive. It was about £4,000 a trip from London to Prague or somewhere like that for one night per person. Would you want to do something like that?
This is museums where you can eat the exhibits. It's not real life. The thing about the Golden Arrow was it was real. It was an actual thing. You could just anyone who could pay could turn up, and it was an actual service. There were cheaper carriages where you didn't get as good service as what we got. But it was anybody could get on it and travel on it if they wanted to for a faster service between London and Paris, and it was part of normal railway life, just as restaurant cars, until very recently were part of normal railway existence. And suddenly, someone seems to have decreed that they're all to be destroyed. There are hardly any to be found anywhere anymore.
Yeah. Do you think it's a wider demand for functionalism across society, not just in train travel, but you talk about airplanes, but actually, once upon a time, planes did used to be much more comfortable than what we see now.
They did, but
architecture,
they also crashed more.
Well, architecture also used to be more beautiful, less functional necessarily.
Well, oddly enough, architecture you can do. This is if you travel beyond Brussels on the Eurostar, on the way to Germany through Liège, there is the most beautiful modern station. The station at Liège is absolutely breathtakingly lovely, and it's entirely modern, and it's a demonstration of what you could do if you really wanted to. So it doesn't need to be old to be beautiful. There are a lot of the European railway stations are rather good, especially Antwerp, which is a sort of cathedral of railways, which everybody should go to. But the whole atmosphere of it was that here it was, before the modernisers went to work, there was another Europe of slightly slower, much more comfortable, much more enjoyable, lying there for anybody who's prepared to use trains. And once I started doing it in the 60s, I then intensively did it for years and years in the 70s and 80s, travelling all over Europe by train as far as I could get. And there was still this network of old-fashioned, I won't say luxury, but pleasure of going by train.
More leisurely.
Leisure, but the sense of adventure of it being proper travel, which you don't really get now, and it also running through the old Mistral, the Trans-Europe Express, which used to run down from Paris to Marseille, actually went down the Rhone Valley. It doesn't anymore because the Rhone Valley is not very much fun for high-speed trains to negotiate because you wind along, but you wind along the road past all the wonderful vineyards, recognising the names of the things you've been drinking, Saint-Joseph being like the Chateau Neuf du Pape. You actually go past it, and it's a marvellous journey. You know what happened to that train? It's an incredible train, wonderfully air-conditioned, high riding with a copper bar in it that you could sit in and look out at the landscape. Francois Mitterrand gave that train to Fidel Castro, and I encountered it many years later in Cuba, between Havana and Santiago, on my way to Guantanamo. And the train was still recognisably the one, but it's not in the same state as it was then. 20 years in the hands of the Cuban Socialist Republic is not good for trains, but it was still an adventure.
That's amazing. Well, Peter, you must write that for another article at some point soon. Thank you so much for joining Spectator TV. That's it for this week. Once again, thanks to Canaccord Genuity Wealth Management for sponsoring the week in 60 minutes. They will provide you with the expertise you need to help you build your wealth with confidence. Visit candowealth.com for more information. And don't forget to subscribe to the Spectator's YouTube channel. Just click the red subscribe button at the bottom of this video and tap the bell icon so you never miss an episode. Thanks again for watching, and do join us again next week.